In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, justice seemed black and white until one cowboy's world was turned upside down. What he discovered about his respected sheriff would challenge everything he believed about right and wrong. This is a story that will make you question what happens when the line between hero and villain becomes blurred. Get ready for a tale that will move you to your core. Jake Morrison had always believed in simple justice. Good versus evil. Right versus wrong. The law was the law, and those who broke it deserved whatever punishment came their way. As he rode into Cedar Ridge that scorching afternoon, dust clouds trailing behind his weathered horse, he carried this unwavering belief like a badge of honor. The town sheriff, Samuel Hayes, was a legend in these parts. For 15 years, he'd kept Cedar Ridge safe from outlaws, cattle rustlers, and every manner of criminal that dared cross into his territory. Jake had heard the stories, how Sheriff Hayes single-handedly captured the notorious Martinez gang, how he'd faced down armed robbers with nothing but his wit and a steady hand. The man was everything Jake aspired to be. Fearless, principled, and absolutely devoted to justice. Jake had come to Cedar Ridge seeking work, but more than that, he'd come seeking purpose. At 28, he'd spent his life drifting from ranch to ranch, never finding his true calling. But something about this town, something about Sheriff Hayes' reputation, made him think he might finally find his place. Maybe he could even become a deputy, learn from the best lawman in the territory. The sheriff's office sat prominently on Main Street, its wooden facade weathered but sturdy, like the man who occupied it. Jake tied his horse to the hitching post and stepped inside, hat in hand. Sheriff Hayes looked up from his paperwork, a tall, graying man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "Can I help you, son?" Hayes asked, his voice warm but authoritative. Jake introduced himself, explaining his desire to serve the law. The sheriff studied him carefully, then nodded slowly. "Tell you what, Jake, I could use an extra pair of eyes around town. Nothing official, mind you, but if you're serious about justice, stick around. Learn by watching. See if you've got the stomach for what real lawkeeping requires." That evening, Jake found lodging at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house and settled in for what he hoped would be the beginning of his new life. As he lay in his narrow bed, listening to the night sounds of Cedar Ridge, he felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow, his education in justice would begin. The next morning brought Jake's first taste of Sheriff Hayes' methods. A merchant named Thompson burst into the office, claiming his store had been robbed during the night. The sheriff listened patiently, taking notes, asking detailed questions about what was missing and who might have had access. Jake watched, impressed by Hayes' thorough approach and genuine concern for the victim. But as they investigated the scene, Jake noticed something odd. The sheriff seemed to know exactly where to look, as if he'd been there before. When they discovered the broken window at the back of the store, Hayes examined it with the expertise of someone familiar with such break-ins. "Looks like the work of young Pete Miller," he concluded. "That boy's been heading down the wrong path since his father died." Pete Miller was only 16, a scrawny kid who'd been struggling to support his sick mother since his father's death in a mining accident 6 months earlier. When they found him, Pete was hollow-eyed and defensive, his hands shaking as he denied any involvement. But the evidence seemed clear. Some of the stolen goods were found in his family's small cabin. Jake expected the sheriff to arrest the boy immediately. Instead, Hayes sat Pete down and talked to him quietly, man to man. "Son, I know things have been hard since your daddy passed, but stealing ain't the answer. It'll only make things worse for you and your ma." Pete broke down, confessing through tears that he'd only taken food and medicine for his dying mother. What happened next surprised Jake even more. Sheriff Hayes didn't drag the boy to jail. Instead, he made a deal with merchant Thompson. Pete would work off his debt at the store, and Hayes would personally ensure the boy stayed on the straight and narrow. Thompson grumbled, but agreed. especially when Hayes quietly slipped him some money to cover the damages. As they walked back to the office, Jake couldn't help but comment, "That was different from what I expected, Sheriff." Hayes stopped and looked at him seriously. "Justice isn't always about punishment, Jake. Sometimes it is about understanding why people do what they do and finding ways to fix the real problem. That boy wasn't a criminal. He was a desperate son trying to save his mother. Lock him up, and all you've done is create a real criminal and let another woman die." Jake nodded, though something nagged at him. The way Hayes had handled the situation was admirable, but there was something about how quickly he'd identified the culprit, how familiar he seemed with the crime scene, that didn't quite sit right. Still, he pushed these doubts aside. This was Sheriff Hayes, after all, the most respected lawman in the territory. 2 weeks into his unofficial apprenticeship, Jake witnessed something that shook his understanding of his mentor to its core. It was late evening when he saw Sheriff Hayes slipping out of his office through the back door, moving with the cautious stealth of someone who didn't want to be seen. Curiosity overcoming his better judgment, Jake followed at a distance. Hayes made his way through the darkened streets to the outskirts of town, where a ramshackle collection of tents and makeshift shelters housed Cedar Ridge's poorest residents. Jake watched in amazement as the sheriff moved from dwelling to dwelling, quietly distributing food, medicine, and money to families in need. At each stop, Hayes spoke softly with the residents, asking about their health, their children, their struggles. But what Jake saw next changed everything. At the Miller cabin, Hayes didn't just check on Pete and his sick mother. He handed Pete a small bundle that looked suspiciously like some of the goods that had been reported stolen from various shops around town. The boy accepted them with tears of gratitude, and Jake heard Hayes whisper, "Your mother's medicine. Don't ask questions. Just make sure she gets better." The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. Sheriff Hayes wasn't just bending the law, he was breaking it. The thefts that had been plaguing Cedar Ridge weren't the work of random criminals. They were orchestrated by the sheriff himself, stealing from the wealthy merchants to provide for the destitute families living on the edge of survival. Jake's world tilted on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about justice, about right and wrong, suddenly seemed less certain. Hayes wasn't the corrupt lawman taking bribes or looking the other way for personal gain. He was a man who had decided that sometimes the law itself was unjust, and that true justice meant ensuring no one in his town went hungry or died from lack of medical care while others prospered. As Jake crept back to his boarding house, his mind raced with conflicting emotions. Was Hayes a criminal who deserved to be turned in? Or was he a hero who had found a way to create real justice in an unjust world? The black and white certainty that had always guided Jake's moral compass was replaced by shades of gray he never imagined existed. The next morning, Hayes greeted him normally, showing no sign that he suspected Jake had discovered his secret. But Jake found himself studying his mentor with new eyes, seeing the weight the sheriff carried, the careful way he balanced his public duties with his private mission of mercy. The man who had seemed like a straightforward hero now appeared as something far more complex and far more human. In the days following his discovery, Jake found himself caught in an internal war between his lifelong beliefs and the harsh realities he was witnessing. Every interaction with Sheriff Hayes became a test of his own moral compass. When a wealthy cattle rancher named Buchanan reported missing supplies from his warehouse, Jake watched Hayes investigate with the same professional thoroughness as always, knowing full well that the sheriff himself was likely responsible for the theft. The weight of this knowledge became unbearable when Jake learned more about the recipients of Hayes' secret charity. There was old Martha Wilson, whose husband had died fighting for the Union in the war, left with 3 young children and no pension. The Hendricks family, whose farm had been destroyed by a flash flood, leaving them with nothing but debt. The widow Garcia, whose husband had been killed in a mining accident caused by the company's negligence, but who received no compensation because she couldn't read the English contracts she'd signed. Each story broke Jake's heart a little more, but also deepened his confusion. These weren't lazy people looking for handouts. They were hard-working families destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, forgotten by a society that preached justice but practiced selective compassion. The crisis came to a head when Buchanan arrived at the sheriff's office with news that would change everything. "Sheriff," the rancher announced, "I've been thinking about those thefts. I want to post a $500 reward for information leading to the arrest of whoever has been stealing from honest businessmen in this town." Jake watched Hayes' face carefully, seeing the slight tension around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. $500 was more money than most people in Cedar Ridge would see in 2 years. It was enough to turn neighbor against neighbor, to make people desperate enough to point fingers at anyone suspicious. That evening, Jake found himself at a crossroads. He could expose Hayes, collect the reward, and restore what he'd always believed was proper justice. The sheriff was, technically, a criminal who had violated his oath and broken the laws he'd sworn to uphold. But Jake had also seen the faces of the families Hayes helped, the children who were alive because of stolen medicine, the mothers who could feed their babies because of pilfered food. As he walked through town that night, Jake noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The sharp divide between the prosperous Main Street businesses and the desperate poverty just beyond the town limits. The way wealthy merchants like Buchanan lived in comfort while families starved within sight of their warehouses full of goods. The legal system that protected property rights but offered no protection for those too poor to own property. Jake realized that Sheriff Hayes hadn't become a criminal overnight. He'd been driven to his actions by witnessing injustice that the law not only failed to address, but actually perpetuated. The question wasn't whether Hayes was right or wrong, it was whether Jake had the courage to see justice as something more complex than he'd ever imagined. The moment of truth arrived 3 days later, when Jake spotted a familiar figure breaking into Buchanan's warehouse under cover of darkness. It was Sheriff Hayes, moving with practiced efficiency as he loaded a small wagon with supplies. Jake's hands trembled as he faced the decision that would define not just Hayes' fate, but his own understanding of what it meant to serve justice. Jake could have stayed hidden, pretending he'd never seen anything. He could have confronted Hayes directly, demanding an explanation he already understood. Instead, he found himself stepping out of the shadows and quietly approaching the sheriff. "Need any help with that, Sheriff?" he whispered. Hayes froze, his hand on a bag of flour. When he turned to face Jake, his expression showed no surprise, only a deep sadness. "How long have you known?" he asked simply. "Long enough to understand why you do it," Jake replied, moving to help load the wagon. "Long enough to see that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." They worked in silence, loading supplies that would feed hungry families and provide medicine for the sick. When they finished, Hayes sat heavily on the wagon seat and looked at Jake with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "I never wanted to become what I am," he said quietly. "When I first pinned on this badge, I believed in the law absolutely. But then I watched good people suffer while bad people prospered, all perfectly legal. I watched children die because their parents couldn't afford medicine that sat rotting in warehouses. I watched families freeze because they couldn't pay rent to landlords who owned more houses than they could ever use." Jake climbed onto the wagon beside him as Hayes continued. "The law protects those who have and punishes those who have not. It calls taking bread to feed your starving child theft, but calls paying starvation wages justice. I couldn't serve that kind of law anymore and still sleep at night." As they made their rounds that night, distributing supplies to grateful families, Jake began to understand the full scope of Hayes' operation. It wasn't random theft. It was a carefully orchestrated system of redistribution. taking excess from those who would never miss it and giving it to those who desperately needed it. Hayes kept meticulous records, ensuring he never took more than necessary and never left any family without help. But Jake also saw the toll it took on the sheriff. Hayes had aged years in the months since he'd begun his double life. The constant stress of living a lie, of knowing that discovery would mean not just imprisonment, but the end of hope for the families he helped, had worn him down to his core. What happens when someone figures it out? Jake asked. When Buchanan's reward money tempts someone enough to start really looking? Hayes smiled grimly. I've been wondering the same thing. Maybe it's time for this old sheriff to retire. Move on before someone gets hurt because of what I've done. He looked at Jake meaningfully. This town needs someone who can find a better way to serve justice. Someone younger, smarter, who can figure out how to help people without breaking the law. The resolution came not through exposure or confrontation, but through an act of unexpected generosity that revealed the true character of Cedar Ridge's citizens. When Mrs. Garcia's youngest child fell desperately ill with pneumonia, Sheriff Hayes found himself facing a crisis that his secret nighttime redistributions couldn't solve. The child needed a doctor, expensive medicine, and round-the-clock care that the family simply couldn't afford. Jake watched Hayes struggle with the situation for 3 agonizing days, seeing the sheriff's internal battle between his duty to the law and his commitment to protecting the innocent. Finally, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He approached Buchanan, the cattle rancher who had posted the reward for the thief's capture. Mr. Buchanan, Jake said, I know who's been taking supplies from your warehouse. The rancher's eyes lit up with anticipation of justice being served, but Jake continued in a way he never expected. It's a family whose child is dying, and they're too proud to ask for help. They take only what they need to keep their baby alive, and they work extra jobs trying to pay it back. They're not criminals, sir. They're desperate parents. Jake had gambled on something he'd observed about the people of Cedar Ridge underneath the surface divisions between rich and poor. There was a fundamental decency that just needed to be awakened. He told Buchanan about Mrs. Garcia, about her husband's death in the mines, about her struggle to care for her children alone. He didn't mention Sheriff Hayes, instead painting a picture of a community where neighbors were suffering in silence. Buchanan listened in stunned silence, then did something that restored Jake's faith in humanity. Instead of demanding arrests, he quietly organized the other business owners to create a fund for families in crisis. Within a week, Mrs. Garcia's child had the medical care he needed, and a dozen other families found themselves lifted from desperation to hope. Sheriff Hayes watched these developments with amazement and relief. As the community came together to address the poverty that had driven him to crime, the need for his secret operations diminished. The businesses began setting aside goods for families in need. A doctor agreed to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay. The church organized work programs to help unemployed men find jobs. On a warm evening, a month later, Sheriff Hayes and Jake sat on the porch of the sheriff's office, watching the sun set over a town that was finally living up to its potential for justice. You did something I never could, Hayes told Jake. You found a way to serve justice without compromising your integrity. Jake shook his head. I learned from you that real justice isn't about following rules. It's about taking care of each other. You taught me that sometimes being right means being willing to be wrong in the eyes of the law. Hayes smiled and removed his badge, handing it to Jake. This town needs a sheriff who understands that justice and law should work together, not against each other. Someone who can build bridges instead of burning them in secret. As Jake pinned on the badge that would define his future, he understood that his view of justice had been forever changed. It was no longer black and white, but something far more complex and beautiful, a living thing that required not just enforcement, but compassion, wisdom, and the courage to do what was right even when it wasn't easy. In discovering Sheriff Hayes' secret, Jake had discovered his own calling. to serve justice not as a rigid set of rules, but as a commitment to ensuring that everyone in his community had the chance to live with dignity and hope.